Imagine having so much money that you could give a complete stranger a fortune, and then walking away, trusting them to use it wisely. But what if that decision led to something far more shocking than you ever expected? In this story, a millionaire gives away a massive sum to someone he barely knows, but when he finds out what that stranger did with the money, it will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out the unbelievable twist in this story of trust, wealth, and the unexpected. The evening sun cast a golden glow over the luxurious terrace, where a group of the city's wealthiest elite had gathered for an exclusive charity event. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the low hum of polite conversation. Among the attendees was Edward Montgomery, a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune through shrewd investments and hard work. Known for his generosity, Edward was the type of man who believed that wealth was a tool to be used for the greater good. Over the years, he had donated millions to various causes, always with the hope of making a positive impact on the world. But tonight was different. As Edward stood near the edge of the terrace, looking out at the breathtaking view of the city below, something in the air felt strange. It wasn't just the event. It was the nagging feeling that had been sitting with him for months, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. Despite all his success, despite all the good he had done, Edward felt empty. The charities he had donated to were important, but he couldn't help but feel like his wealth wasn't truly making a difference in the lives of the people who needed it most. As he sipped his drink, lost in thought, he heard a voice behind him. "Quite the view, isn't it?" Edward turned to see a man standing just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, with clothes that seemed just a little too worn for an event like this. The man didn't look like he belonged among the wealthy attendees, but something about his presence intrigued Edward. "Yes, it is," Edward replied, offering a polite smile. "Do you live in the city?" The man nodded. "For now, yes, but I don't know how long that'll last." There was something in the man's voice, a sadness, a sense of uncertainty, that piqued Edward's curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Life has a way of changing when you least expect it. One day you're on top of the world and the next, well, let's just say things can fall apart pretty quickly." Edward frowned, intrigued by the man's cryptic words. "What happened to you?" The man glanced around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening, then turned back to Edward. "I used to have everything," he said quietly. "A family, a career, a home, but I lost it all. One mistake, one bad decision, and everything I worked for was gone. Now, I'm just trying to survive." Edward felt a pang of empathy for the stranger. He had heard stories like this before, people who had lost everything and were left with nothing but regret. But there was something different about this man. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, made Edward believe that he wasn't just another person down on his luck. There was something more to his story. "What if you had a second chance?" Edward asked suddenly, surprising even himself with the question. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" Edward took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent years giving money to causes he believed in, but tonight he felt compelled to do something different, something radical. What if, instead of donating to a charity or an organization, he gave directly to someone who needed it? What if he put his trust in a complete stranger? "I'm serious," Edward said, his voice steady. "What if I gave you a second chance? What if I gave you enough money to change your life?" The man stared at him, clearly taken aback. "You don't even know me," he said slowly. "Why would you do that?" Edward smiled. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's time to trust someone I don't know." For a long moment the man was silent, as if trying to decide whether or not Edward was serious. But as he looked into Edward's eyes, he seemed to see something genuine, something that made him believe this offer wasn't a joke. "How much are we talking about?" the man finally asked. Edward didn't hesitate. $1 million. The man's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious." "I am," Edward replied. $1 million. No strings attached. You can do whatever you want with it. All I ask is that you use it wisely." The stranger's face was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Edward said, his voice firm. "I'm trusting you to make the most of this opportunity. Whatever you decide to do with the money is up to you." The man hesitated, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Edward paused, considering the question. "Because sometimes it's not about who deserves it," he said slowly. "It's about who needs it, and I believe that right now you need this." For a moment, the man looked like he might refuse. The idea of someone handing him a fortune, no questions asked, seemed too good to be true. But as he stood there, staring at Edward, something shifted in his expression. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a strange mix of gratitude and determination. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take it." Edward smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This was the right decision. He was sure of it. "Good," he said. "I'll have the money transferred to you by tomorrow morning." The man nodded, still looking slightly dazed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Edward replied. "Just make the most of it." With that, the two men shook hands, and the stranger disappeared into the crowd. Edward watched him go, a strange sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had done something bold, something different. But as he stood there, staring out at the city once more, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Had he just made a mistake? Could he really trust a stranger with such a large sum of money? Only time would tell. Days passed, and Edward tried to put the encounter out of his mind. He had no way of knowing what the man had done with the money, and in truth he didn't expect to hear from him again. But the thought of it lingered at the back of his mind, gnawing at him. Then, one afternoon, while Edward was sitting in his office reviewing some paperwork, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you." Edward glanced up, surprised. "I don't have any appointments today." "I know," the assistant replied, looking slightly uncomfortable. "But he said you'd want to see him. He wouldn't give his name, but he mentioned something about $1 million. Edward's heart skipped a beat. "Send him in," he said quickly. A moment later, the door opened and the man from the charity event stepped inside. He looked different, cleaner, more put together. His clothes, though simple, were well fitted and neat, and his expression was calm and confident. He looked like a man who had turned his life around. Edward stood, unable to hide his surprise. "It's you," he said. The man smiled. "I told you I'd make the most of that second chance." Edward couldn't help but stare at the man standing before him, the same stranger to whom he had given $1 million just days ago. But now, the man looked like a completely different person. Gone were the worn clothes and the weary expression. In their place was a figure of confidence and composure, a man who seemed to have found his footing again. Edward gestured for the man to take a seat, his curiosity piqued. "I have to admit," he said, sitting down across from him, "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." The man smiled, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I don't blame you. I imagine you've had second thoughts about giving that kind of money to a complete stranger." Edward chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I wouldn't say second thoughts, but I'll admit, I was curious about what you'd do with it." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose that's why I'm here. I wanted to show you what your trust has led to." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized folder, placing it on Edward's desk. "These are the plans for a project I've been working on, something I've always wanted to do but never had the resources to make a reality." Edward raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He opened the folder and scanned the contents. What he found was a comprehensive business plan, outlining a community development project aimed at revitalizing struggling neighborhoods. The proposal included affordable housing, job training centers, and small business support, all designed to help lift people out of poverty and give them the tools they needed to succeed. This is incredible, Edward said, flipping through the pages. You put all of the money into this? The man nodded. Every cent. You see, I wasn't always down on my luck. I used to run a business, a successful one at that, but a few bad decisions, some unexpected losses, and everything came crashing down. I lost my company, my home, and eventually, my family. I hit rock bottom, and for a long time, I thought I'd never get back up again. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But that night at the charity event when you offered me a second chance, it was like a lifeline. It reminded me of who I used to be and who I could be again. So instead of using the money for myself, I decided to invest it in something bigger, something that could help other people who are struggling, just like I was. Edward sat in stunned silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of the man's words. This was beyond anything he had expected. He had thought the man might use the money to get back on his feet, maybe start a new business or buy a home. But this was a vision for something far greater, something that had the potential to change countless lives. I don't know what to say, Edward finally managed. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. The man smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. You gave me an opportunity, Edward. You trusted me when no one else would. And now, I want to repay that trust by building something that will make a real difference. Edward felt a swell of emotion as he looked at the man sitting across from him. It was a reminder of why he had made the decision in the first place. To take a risk, to trust someone when it seemed like the odds were against them. And now, seeing the results of that trust, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in a long time. This project, Edward said, his voice steady. How can I help? Over the next several months, Edward and the man, whose name he learned was Daniel, worked together to bring the community development project to life. With Edward's financial backing and Daniel's vision, they were able to secure the land, hire contractors, and begin construction on the first set of affordable housing units. Word quickly spread about the project, and soon, they had the support of local businesses, community leaders, and even government officials who saw the potential impact of what they were building. For Edward, it was a transformative experience. He had spent years giving to charities and supporting causes he believed in. But this was different. This was personal. He had watched as Daniel, a man who had once lost everything, took the opportunity he was given and turned it into something extraordinary. And as the project grew, so did Edward's sense of purpose. He wasn't just a passive donor, he was actively involved in creating something that would have a lasting impact on people's lives. But not everyone was supportive. As the project gained attention, it also attracted criticism. Some of Edward's wealthy friends and business associates questioned his decision to give such a large sum of money to a stranger. They saw it as reckless, a gamble that could have easily backfired. I can't believe you actually went through with it, one of his colleagues said during a lunch meeting. $1 million just like that? You didn't even know the guy. What if he had run off with the money? Edward smiled, taking a sip of his drink. But he didn't. And now we're building something that will change lives. The colleague shook his head, clearly unconvinced. Still, it was a huge risk. You could have lost everything. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Sometimes the biggest rewards come from the biggest risks. And this is worth it. As the months went by, the project continued to progress. But with its success came new challenges. There were delays in construction, disputes with contractors, and even pushback from local politicians who were skeptical of the project's long-term viability. But through it all, Edward and Daniel remained committed to their vision. They knew that what they were building wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about giving people hope, about creating opportunities where there had been none. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and negotiations, Edward and Daniel sat together on the construction site, looking out at the nearly completed housing units. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings, and for a moment, everything felt right. You know, Edward said quietly, When I gave you that money, I wasn't sure what would happen. I didn't know if you'd use it wisely, or if I'd ever see you again. But now, I can't imagine a better outcome." Daniel smiled, his expression thoughtful. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, Edward. You gave me a second chance, and I'll never forget that." Edward shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You took the opportunity and turned it into something amazing. I'm just glad I was able to help." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. But then, Daniel spoke again, his voice more serious. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. "Something I've been meaning to share for a while now." Edward turned to him, curious. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "The night we met, the charity event. It wasn't just a coincidence. I was there because I'd heard about you. I knew about your reputation, your generosity, and I went there hoping to meet you." Edward frowned, surprised by the admission. "You were looking for me?" Daniel nodded, his expression sincere. "I was at rock bottom, Edward. I had nothing left, and I didn't know what to do. But then I heard about you, the millionaire who was known for giving to those in need. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but I figured if anyone could help me, it would be you." Edward sat back, processing what Daniel had just said. He had always thought their meeting had been a chance encounter, a moment of fate. But now, knowing that Daniel had sought him out, he wasn't sure how to feel. "You planned this?" Edward asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Daniel shook his head quickly. "Not like that. I didn't go there expecting you to give me $1 million. I needed a lifeline. And when you offered me that second chance, it was more than I ever could have hoped for." Edward was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't feel betrayed, but the revelation was unsettling. All this time he had believed that his decision to give Daniel the money had been based on a gut feeling, a sense of trust in a stranger. But now, it seemed that there had been more to the story. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," Daniel said quietly. "I didn't want you to think that I manipulated you or took advantage of your kindness. I was desperate." Edward looked at him, his expression softening. He could see the sincerity in Daniel's eyes, the regret in his voice. And in that moment he realized that it didn't matter how their paths had crossed. What mattered was what had come of it. "I understand," Edward said finally, his voice calm. "And I'm glad you told me." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." After Daniel's revelation, things between him and Edward shifted slightly. While Edward didn't feel manipulated, the knowledge that Daniel had intentionally sought him out lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't a betrayal, but it complicated the simple narrative Edward had created for himself about trust and chance. Still, Edward remained committed to their shared project. He knew that what they were building was bigger than either of them. This was about creating real change, and they were too far along to let anything derail that. The construction of the housing units was nearly complete, and the job training centers were already seeing their first batch of applicants. The project was a success, and yet, despite everything they had accomplished, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. His sense of fulfillment hadn't come as easily as he had hoped. One afternoon, Edward was walking through the construction site, observing the final touches being made to the buildings. Workers moved quickly, laying the last of the bricks, installing windows, and landscaping the surrounding area. It was an impressive sight. What had once been a rundown part of the city was now transformed into something vibrant and full of potential. As Edward stood there, taking it all in, he noticed a young man sitting on a bench near the entrance to the job training center. The man looked worn down, his clothes ragged and his face etched with exhaustion. Something about him reminded Edward of Daniel, back when they had first met at the charity event. Curious, Edward approached the man. "Are you waiting for someone?" Edward asked gently. The young man looked up, startled, and shook his head. "No, I don't know." I don't really have anywhere to go. Edward frowned, taking a seat beside him. What's your name? Evan, the young man replied quietly. Edward nodded. What brings you here, Evan? Evan hesitated as if unsure whether to answer. After a moment, he sighed. I heard about this place, about how it's supposed to help people like me get back on their feet. I've been out of work for months, lost my apartment a while ago, and I just don't know where to turn anymore. Edward's heart went out to the young man. He had heard similar stories before, people who had fallen on hard times with no safety net to catch them. It was exactly why he and Daniel had started this project, to help people like Evan rebuild their lives. But seeing the desperation in Evan's eyes brought the reality of their mission into sharper focus. Well, you're in the right place, Edward said, his voice warm. We've got job training programs, housing support, and people who are here to help you get back on track. Evan looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. You really think this place can help me? Edward smiled. I know it can. Over the next few weeks, Edward kept tabs on Evan's progress. The young man enrolled in one of the job training programs and quickly proved himself to be hardworking and determined. He found temporary housing in one of the newly built units and began to get his life back on track. Seeing Evan's transformation reignited something in Edward, a reminder of why he had started all of this in the first place. It wasn't about the money or the recognition. It was about the people whose lives were being changed. But as Edward grew closer to the project's completion, Daniel seemed more distant. He still showed up for meetings, still worked on logistics and oversight, but there was something off. The easy camaraderie they had once shared was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that Edward couldn't quite pinpoint. One evening, after a particularly long day, Edward decided to confront Daniel. They met at the site of the nearly finished community center, a building that would serve as the heart of their project, offering everything from educational programs to mental health services. The sun was setting, casting a soft glow over the construction site, and the sounds of workers finishing their shifts filled the air. Daniel, Edward began, his tone cautious. I feel like we haven't been on the same page lately. Is something going on? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been thinking a lot, Edward. About the project, about everything we've built. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe this isn't enough. Edward frowned, confused. What do you mean? We've done something incredible here. We're helping people, changing lives. I know, Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. But I keep thinking, what if we're just putting a band-aid on a much bigger problem? What if after all of this nothing really changes? People will still fall through the cracks, the system will still fail them. I don't know if this is the solution. Edward stared at Daniel, taken aback by his words. He had never heard Daniel express doubts about their mission before, and it left him feeling unsettled. We can't fix everything, Edward said slowly, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. What we've done here, it matters. It's making a difference. Daniel shook his head, his frustration evident. I just feel like I could be doing more, like I'm meant to do something bigger. Edward was silent for a moment, trying to process Daniel's words. He had always admired Daniel's passion, his drive to help others. But now it seemed like that drive was pushing him towards something beyond their current project. Are you thinking about leaving? Edward asked quietly, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Daniel hesitated, his expression conflicted. I don't know. Maybe. I love what we've built here, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something else I'm supposed to be doing. Edward's heart sank. He had come to rely on Daniel not just as a partner in this project, but as a friend. The thought of losing him, of Daniel walking away, was hard to accept. But at the same time, Edward understood the restlessness that Daniel felt. After all, Edward had spent much of his own life chasing fulfillment, looking for something that would make him feel like he was truly making a difference. If that's what you need to do, Edward said carefully, I'll support you, but you've done something incredible here, Daniel. Don't underestimate that." Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Edward. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm grateful for everything we've accomplished together." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the workers packed up for the day. The community center was nearly complete, and soon their project would be fully realized. But even as they looked out at the fruits of their labor, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point for both of them. A few weeks later, the grand opening of the community center arrived. The event was a celebration of all the hard work that had gone into the project, with local officials, business leaders, and members of the community in attendance. There were speeches, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and tours of the new facilities. The atmosphere was electric, filled with hope and excitement for the future. But as Edward stood on the stage delivering his speech to the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweetness. Daniel had decided to step back from the project, handing over the day-to-day operations to a team of trusted leaders while he pursued other opportunities. They had parted on good terms, but Edward knew that their partnership would never be the same. As the applause rang out and the cameras flashed, Edward looked out at the sea of faces. People who had been touched by the work they had done, people whose lives had been changed. He felt proud, but he also felt the weight of what Daniel had said that night. Was this enough? Was this really the solution to the larger problems they were trying to address? Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the festivities had ended, Edward walked through the quiet halls of the community center. The building was beautiful, a symbol of hope and progress. But as he wandered through the empty rooms, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. That was when he saw Evan, the young man he had met weeks ago, standing in the doorway of one of the classrooms. Evan's face lit up when he saw Edward. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I just wanted to thank you again. I got a job. Because of this place, I was able to get back on my feet. You have no idea what this has meant to me." Edward smiled, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. "I'm glad to hear that, Evan. You deserve it." Evan nodded, his eyes bright with gratitude. "This place, it's more than just a building. It's hope. It's a second chance. For people like me, it's everything." As Edward listened to Evan's words, something inside him shifted. Maybe the project wasn't a solution to every problem. Maybe it wouldn't change the entire system. But for people like Evan, it was enough. It was a start. And for Edward, that was all that mattered. The weeks following the grand opening of the community center were a period of reflection for Edward. With Daniel stepping away to pursue other projects, the full weight of the operation fell on Edward's shoulders. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, Edward embraced the responsibility. He realized that despite the challenges, this was what he had been searching for all along, a way to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Each day, Edward would visit the community center, meeting with the staff, speaking with the residents of the new housing units, and checking in on the job training programs. The center was thriving, and the impact it was having on the local community was undeniable. Families who had been struggling to make ends meet now had a place to call home. People who had been unemployed for months were gaining new skills and finding steady work. The center had become a hub of hope and transformation, just as Edward and Daniel had envisioned. But there was still a part of Edward that couldn't let go of Daniel's words, the idea that they were only putting a band-aid on a much larger issue. It was true that the center was helping people, but Edward knew that the problems they were addressing, poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, were systemic and deeply entrenched. Was there more that he could do? Was there a way to address these issues on a larger scale? One day, as Edward was walking through the community garden that had been built next to the housing units, he found himself deep in thought. The garden had become a place of solace for many of the residents, a place where they could relax, reflect, and grow their own food. As Edward walked among the rows of vegetables and flowers, he spotted Evan, the young man he had met when the project was still in its early stages. Evan was kneeling by one of the garden beds, carefully tending to the plants. When he saw Edward, He stood up and smiled. "Hey, Mr. Montgomery," Evan said, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's good to see you." Edward smiled back. "Good to see you too, Evan. How's everything going?" Evan's face lit up with excitement. "It's going great. I've been working at the job I got through the training program, and I'm saving up to get my own apartment. This place, it's changed everything for me." Edward felt a swell of pride as he listened to Evan's words. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he and Daniel had started the project, to give people a second chance, to help them rebuild their lives. But as proud as he was of what they had accomplished, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more he could do. "Evan," Edward said after a moment, "what do you think we could do to help even more people like you? What else do you think this community needs?" Evan frowned thoughtfully, his brow furrowing as he considered the question. "Well," he said slowly, "the housing and job training programs are great, but I think what a lot of people really need is a sense of stability. It's hard to focus on finding a job or building a future when you don't know if you'll have a roof over your head tomorrow or if you'll be able to afford food next week. I think maybe we need more support for basic needs, things like affordable childcare, mental health services, and access to healthcare. If people knew they had those things taken care of, they'd be able to focus more on getting back on their feet." Edward nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. Evan was right. Providing housing and job training was important, but there were other, equally important factors that contributed to a person's ability to succeed. If they could expand the services offered by the center to include more comprehensive support for people's basic needs, they could make an even greater impact. "Thank you, Evan," Edward said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've given me a lot to think about." Over the next few months, Edward began working on plans to expand the services offered by the community center. He brought in experts in healthcare, mental health, and early childhood education to develop programs that would address the needs that Evan had highlighted. It was a massive undertaking, but Edward was determined to see it through. He knew that this was the next step in making a real, lasting difference in the lives of the people who came to the center for help. As the new programs took shape, the center became more than just a place for housing and job training. It became a full-service community hub. There were now on-site healthcare clinics where residents could receive medical care, mental health counselors who provided therapy and support, and affordable childcare programs that allowed parents to focus on their work or education without worrying about the cost of care for their children. The response from the community was overwhelming. More and more people were coming to the center, not just for the original services, but for the new programs that Edward had implemented. And as the center's reputation grew, so did its impact. Other cities began to take notice, and soon, Edward was fielding calls from leaders across the country who wanted to replicate the model in their own communities. For Edward, this was the fulfillment of everything he had hoped for. The project had grown far beyond his original vision, and it was making a real, tangible difference in the lives of thousands of people. But as proud as he was of what they had accomplished, he couldn't help but think of Daniel. Daniel had been the catalyst for all of this. It was his vision, his drive, that had brought them together and set them on this path. And even though Daniel had stepped away, Edward still thought of him often, wondering what he was doing and whether he had found the something bigger he had been searching for. One evening, as Edward was leaving the center after a long day of meetings, he saw a familiar figure standing by the entrance. It was Daniel. Edward's heart skipped a beat as he approached. "Daniel," he said, his voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Daniel smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said before I left, about what we've built here." Edward raised an eyebrow. And I realized that you were right," Daniel said quietly. "We did something incredible. This project, it's more than I ever imagined, and I'm proud of that. But I needed time to figure out where I fit into it all." Edward nodded, understanding. "Have you figured it out?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think so. I've been working on a few things, smaller projects that focus on policy changes and advocacy. I'm trying to tackle some of the bigger systemic issues we talked about. But seeing this place again, it reminds me that real change starts with people, with giving them the tools and support they need to build better lives. And I think that's something I lost sight of for a while. Edward smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. I'm glad to hear that. You know, you're always welcome here. This place wouldn't exist without you. Daniel looked around at the bustling center, the people coming and going, and nodded. I know, and I'm proud of what we did. But I think it's time for me to focus on the next step, on changing the systems that put people in these situations in the first place. I want to work on prevention, not just intervention. Edward admired Daniel's passion and dedication, even if their paths were taking them in different directions. He knew that Daniel would continue to make a difference in the world, just as he had with this project. And in his own way, Edward had found peace in the knowledge that their work together had laid the foundation for something much bigger. As time passed, Edward's community center continued to grow and evolve. New programs were added, more people were helped, and the project expanded to other cities, thanks to partnerships with local governments and non-PR. What had started as a bold experiment, a millionaire giving a fortune to a stranger, had turned into a national movement, changing lives across the country. And through it all, Edward never lost sight of the original mission, to help people like Evan, people who needed a second chance. The work was never easy, and there were always challenges, but Edward had learned that true fulfillment didn't come from wealth or success. It came from making a difference, from giving people the opportunity to change their own lives. One afternoon, as Edward walked through the bustling halls of the community center, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The project had become more than he ever could have imagined, and he knew that it would continue to grow and thrive long after he was gone. This was his legacy, not the wealth he had accumulated or the businesses he had built, but the lives he had touched, the people he had helped. As Edward watched a group of children playing in the garden, laughing and carefree, he realized that in the end, it wasn't about changing the whole world. It was about changing one life at a time. And that was enough. As the community center expanded and continued to thrive, Edward began to notice something shifting. The initial rush of success and fulfillment that had come from seeing lives transformed was slowly being overshadowed by a new wave of challenges. The bigger the project grew, the more complicated it became. The logistics of managing multiple locations, each with its own unique set of needs, were overwhelming. And while Edward had a competent team in place to handle the day-to-day operations, the weight of responsibility still rested on his shoulders. The expansion had drawn national attention, and with that attention came scrutiny. Some people questioned whether the community centers were sustainable in the long term. Critics pointed out that while the centers were providing valuable services, they weren't addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality. The media began to publish articles questioning the effectiveness of the programs, and Edward found himself under increasing pressure to defend the project he had worked so hard to build. One evening, as Edward sat in his office going over the latest reports, he received a call from a journalist who had been following the development of the community centers. The journalist wanted to do an in-depth piece on the project, but the tone of his questions made it clear that the article wouldn't be entirely positive. "What do you say to the critics who argue that your centers are just a temporary fix?" the journalist asked. "That you're not really solving the bigger issues of systemic inequality?" Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had heard these criticisms before, and while he understood the concerns, he couldn't help but feel frustrated. "We're doing what we can," he replied. "No single project can solve every problem, but that doesn't mean the work we're doing isn't valuable. We're helping people in real, tangible ways, and that matters." "But do you think it's enough?" the journalist pressed. "Do you think that what you've built here will have a lasting impact, or is it just a band-aid on a much larger wound?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Edward had asked himself the same thing countless times. He believed in the work they were doing, but there was no denying that the problems they were addressing, poverty, housing insecurity, unemployment, were deeply rooted in systems that went far beyond what a single community center could fix. "I think we're making a difference," Edward said finally, his voice steady. "It may not be enough to change the entire system, but for the people who come through our doors, it's a lifeline. And for now, that's enough." The interview left Edward feeling unsettled. As much as he wanted to believe in the work they were doing, the criticisms gnawed at him. He had always known that the community center wouldn't solve everything, but hearing it framed in such stark terms made him question whether he was doing enough. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel and the conversation they'd had before he left. The idea that they were only addressing symptom. A few days later, Edward received an unexpected message from Daniel. It had been months since they had last spoken, and while Edward had heard through the grapevine that Daniel was doing well with his policy work, they hadn't kept in touch. The message was brief, but it got straight to the point. "We need to talk. There's something you should know." Edward's heart raced as he read the message. What could Daniel possibly want after all this time? Was there something wrong with the project, or was this about something else entirely? They arranged to meet at a cafe not far from the original community center, the place where it had all started. When Edward arrived, he found Daniel sitting at a table, looking more serious than he had ever seen him. His usual air of calm confidence was gone, replaced by a tension that Edward could feel from across the room. "Daniel," Edward greeted him as he sat down, trying to keep his voice light. "It's been a while." Daniel nodded, but there was no smile. "It has," he replied, his tone flat. "And there's a reason for that." Edward frowned, his unease growing. "What's going on?" Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. "I've been looking into some things, some connections between the contractors we used for the expansion of the community centers and certain, less than reputable entities." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Daniel continued, his voice low, "that some of the people involved in the construction and management of the new centers aren't who they claim to be. There's evidence that some of the contractors have ties to organized crime, and they've been using the project." Edward felt as though the ground had just shifted beneath him. "That can't be true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We vetted everyone. "I know," Daniel interrupted, his expression grim. "I didn't want to believe it either. But the more I dug, the more I found. These people are smart. They've hidden their tracks well, but there are too many red flags to ignore." Edward's mind raced, trying to process what Daniel was telling him. He had always prided himself on running an ethical, transparent project. The idea that criminals had infiltrated the very thing he had worked so hard to build was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Edward asked, his voice tight with emotion. Daniel looked away, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to believe it myself. But I couldn't keep quiet any longer. You need to know the truth." For a moment, Edward sat in stunned silence, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief, anger, and betrayal. How could this have happened? How could he have been so blind? "What do we do now?" Edward asked finally, his voice hollow. Daniel met his gaze, his expression serious. "We go public. We expose the corruption and cut ties with anyone involved. It's going to be a mess, but it's the only way to save the project." Edward nodded slowly, though his heart felt heavy with dread. He knew Daniel was right, this was the only way forward, but the thought of watching everything they had built come crashing down was almost unbearable. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of chaos. Edward and Daniel worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the corruption within the project, and the revelations were even worse than they had anticipated. Several of the contractors and subcontractors involved in the expansion had been funneling money through the project, using it as a front for illegal activities. It was a scandal that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. Edward held a press conference to address the situation, standing in front of a room full of reporters and cameras. His face was pale, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he explained what had happened. "We trusted the wrong people," Edward said, his voice heavy with regret. "And for that I take full responsibility. But I want to make one thing clear. The work we have done, the lives we have changed, none of that is diminished by the actions of a few bad actors. We will do everything in our power to ensure that this project continues, free from corruption, and that it remains a place of hope and support for those who need it." The fallout was swift. Several key figures were arrested, and Edward's reputation took a hit. The media coverage was relentless, and the project was under intense scrutiny. But through it all, Edward remained determined to save what they had built. He cut ties with the corrupt contractors, restructured the leadership team, and brought in new oversight to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. And despite the scandal, the community centers remained open. The people who had been helped, the families who had found homes, the individuals who had gained new skills, continued to benefit from the services provided. Edward knew that the project wasn't perfect, but he also knew that it had made a difference. In the weeks following the press conference, Edward received countless messages of support from the people whose lives had been touched by the community centers. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from Evan, the young man Edward had met early on in the project. "I know things have been tough, but I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I've got my life back. Don't let this stop you from doing what you're meant to do. Keep fighting." As Edward read the message, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was going to be difficult, but he wasn't ready to give up. The project might have been tainted by corruption, but the work they were doing, the lives they were changing, was still worth fighting for. And so, with Daniel by his side, Edward made a vow to keep pushing forward. They would rebuild, they would restore trust, and they would continue their mission to help those who needed it most. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the scandal, not the setbacks, but the people. The storm that had engulfed Edward's life was far from over, but as the weeks passed, the chaos began to settle. The initial shock of the corruption scandal had subsided, and the focus had shifted to rebuilding trust in the community centers. It wasn't easy. There were still whispers of doubt, still headlines that cast a shadow over the project. But for every person who questioned whether the centers could survive, there were dozens more whose lives had been changed because of them. Edward stood at the edge of the construction site for a new expansion, a smaller, more targeted project that would offer even more specialized services, including mental health care and legal aid for low-income families. It was a direct response to the criticisms that the centers were only addressing symptoms, rather than the root causes of poverty and inequality. This time, Edward was taking every precaution to ensure that no one could take advantage of the system again. The project was smaller, more manageable, and carefully monitored. After the scandal, Edward had put new structures in place, hiring a team of experts in nonprofit governance and compliance to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. There were new checks and balances, strict oversight, and a focus on transparency that would restore faith in the community centers. But despite the progress, Edward couldn't shake the feeling of lingering guilt. He had been naive, too trusting. The realization that he had allowed criminals to infiltrate the very project he had built to help people was a hard pill to swallow. But there was no turning back. All he could do now was continue to push forward, to rebuild what had been damaged, and to make sure the people who depended on the centers were never left in the lurch. One afternoon, as Edward was overseeing the new expansion, he received a visitor he hadn't expected. Evan. "Mr. Montgomery," Evan called out, waving as he approached the construction site. "Do you have a minute?" Edward smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Of course, Evan. How are you? I heard you're doing well." Evan nodded, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I've been doing great. Actually, that's why I wanted to talk to you." Edward raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's on your mind?" Evan took a deep breath, his expression suddenly serious. "I wanted to thank you again for everything. You in the center, it's changed my life. But I also wanted to tell you that I'm ready to give back." Edward blinked, surprised. Give back? What do you mean? I mean, I want to help, Evan said, his eyes bright with determination. I've been thinking a lot about what you've done for me and for so many other people, and I want to be part of that. I want to help other people the way you helped me. Edward felt a surge of pride as he looked at Evan. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he had started the project. To give people the tools they needed, not only to rebuild their own lives, but to lift others up as well. That's incredible, Evan, Edward said, his voice filled with emotion. What do you want to do? Evan hesitated for a moment, then smiled. I want to start working here. I've been talking to some of the staff, and I think I could be a mentor for people who are going through what I went through. I know what it's like to be in that position, to feel like you're at rock bottom with no way out. And I want to show them that there is a way out. Edward's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. Evan's journey, from someone who had once sat on the sidelines unsure of his future, to someone who now wanted to give back, was the embodiment of what the community centers were all about. I think that's a great idea, Edward said warmly. You'd be a natural at it. I can't think of anyone better to help guide people through this process. Evan's smile widened. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I owe everything to you and the center. This is my way of paying it forward. Evan's decision to join the staff as a mentor marked a turning point for Edward. It was a reminder that despite everything that had gone wrong, the scandal, the setbacks, the criticism, the work they were doing was still making a real difference. For every person who doubted the impact of the community centers, there were countless others whose lives had been transformed because of them. And now, with people like Evan stepping up to take on leadership roles within the project, Edward knew that the legacy of the centers would continue long after he was gone. The new expansion project moved forward without incident, and soon, the additional services were up and running. The community center had evolved into a comprehensive support network, offering everything from housing assistance and job training to healthcare, legal aid, and mental health services. The impact was undeniable. Families who had once been struggling were now thriving. Children who had grown up in unstable environments were receiving the support they needed to succeed in school. And people like Evan, who had once felt lost and hopeless, were now leading the charge, helping others find their way. One evening, as Edward walked through the halls of the original community center, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It had all started with a simple, impulsive decision to trust a stranger with $1 million. At the time, it had seemed like a crazy idea, one that could have easily backfired. But looking around at the thriving center, at the lives that had been changed, Edward knew that it had been the right decision. But the journey hadn't been easy. Edward had faced more obstacles than he could have ever imagined: corruption, betrayal, and moments of doubt that had threatened to derail everything. There had been times when he had questioned whether the project was worth it, whether the risks were too great. But through it all, he had kept going, driven by a simple truth, that helping people was always worth the risk. As Edward passed the community garden, he spotted Evan sitting on a bench talking with a young man who looked nervous and unsure. Evan was leaning forward, speaking softly, his expression filled with empathy. It was a scene that warmed Edward's heart, a reminder that the work they were doing wasn't just about buildings and programs. It was about people. It was about giving someone a second chance, about helping them see their own potential. Edward paused for a moment, watching as Evan encouraged the young man, offering him words of hope and support. It was a full-circle moment. Evan, who had once been in the same position, was now the one giving someone else a lifeline. Au censeur. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the community center, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would always be obstacles to overcome, critics to face, and problems to solve. But Edward knew that the work they were doing mattered. It was real, it was tangible, and it was making a difference. Later that evening, as Edward sat on the terrace of his penthouse looking out at the city skyline, he received a message from Daniel. It was brief, but it made Edward smile. You did it. Keep going. Edward replied with a simple message of his own. We did it. The next day, Edward visited the community center again, meeting with the staff and checking in on the new expansion project. As he walked through the busy halls, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his legacy, not the wealth he had accumulated, not the business empire he had built, but the lives he had touched through the community centers. As he walked past the entrance, he saw a new group of residents moving into the housing units. They were greeted by the staff, who guided them through the process and welcomed them into the community. It was a scene Edward had witnessed countless times before, but it never failed to fill him with pride. The community center was more than just a project. It was a place of hope, of second chances, of new beginnings. And as long as it existed, Edward knew that he had made a difference in the world. Several years had passed since the tumultuous days of the corruption scandal, and the community centers had not only survived, but flourished. What had once been a single center had now grown into a network of facilities across the country, each one providing critical support to those in need. Edward's vision had become a national model for community-based intervention, praised for its holistic approach to addressing poverty, housing insecurity, and unemployment. But more importantly, the centers had become a beacon of hope for the people they served. Lives were being transformed, families were being lifted out of poverty, and entire communities were thriving thanks to the services provided. The centers had evolved beyond their original purpose, incorporating mental health care, legal aid, educational programs, and more. And through it all, Edward remained at the heart of the project, committed to ensuring that the legacy of the centers would continue to grow. Edward's name had become synonymous with philanthropy, but unlike many other wealthy benefactors, he had always shied away from the limelight. For him, the work was never about recognition or accolades. It was about the people whose lives had been changed, the Evans of the world, who had been given a second chance and had made the most of it. As Edward stood on the balcony of his penthouse one evening, looking out over the city skyline, he thought back to the moment that had started it all. The night he had met Daniel at the charity event. The night he had decided to give a fortune to a complete stranger. It had been a decision born out of instinct, a leap of faith that could have easily backfired. And yet, that simple act of trust had set in motion a chain of events that had changed not only Daniel's life, but countless others. Edward's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen and saw a message from Evan. I thought you'd like to know. We're opening 2 new centers next month. I'm heading up one of them. Thank you for believing in me. A smile tugged at the corners of Edward's lips as he read the message. Evan had become one of the leading figures in the community center network, using his own experiences to mentor others and guide the organization's expansion. Watching Evan grow into a leader had been one of Edward's greatest sources of pride, a testament to the power of second chances. As Edward typed out a quick reply, thanking Evan for the update and congratulating him on the new centers, he reflected on how far they had come. The centers had started as a bold experiment, a risky investment in people who had been overlooked by society. But now, they were a lifeline for thousands of individuals and families, offering them hope, support, and the opportunity to rebuild their lives. Later that night, as Edward prepared for bed, he received another message, this time from Daniel. You were right. It wasn't about changing the whole system. It was about helping the people we could. Thank you for that. Edward stared at the message for a long moment, his heart swelling with gratitude. Daniel had gone on to pursue policy work, advocating for systemic change on a broader scale, but even he had come to realize that the real impact came from the individuals they had helped along the way. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about doing what they could, where they could. The next morning, Edward arrived at the original community center for a special event. The staff had organized a celebration to mark the 10-year anniversary of the center's founding, and it was set to be a joyous occasion. As he walked through the familiar halls, he was greeted by staff members, volunteers, and residents, many of whom had been with the center since the very beginning. The event was held in the community garden, the same place where Edward had once sat with Evan discussing the future. Now the garden was lush and vibrant, filled with flowers, vegetables, and herbs that the residents tended to with care. It had become a symbol of growth and renewal, a place where people could find peace and solace amidst the challenges of life. As Edward took his seat at the front of the garden, the event began. There were speeches from community leaders, testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the center, and performances by local children who had benefited from the educational programs. The atmosphere was one of joy and celebration, a reminder of all the good that had come from the simple act of giving. But the highlight of the event came when Evan took the stage. 10 years ago, I was lost. Evan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I didn't know where my life was going, and I didn't think I had a future, but this place, this center, gave me hope. It gave me a chance to start over, to rebuild my life. And now I'm standing here, not just as someone who was helped, but as someone who is helping others. Evan paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. This place has changed lives. It's changed mine, and it's changed the lives of so many others. And none of it would have been possible without Edward Montgomery. The crowd erupted into applause as Evan gestured for Edward to join him on stage. Reluctantly, Edward stood and made his way to the front, feeling a surge of emotion as he looked out at the people who had gathered to celebrate the center's anniversary. These were the people whose lives had been touched by the project, the people who had found hope and opportunity because of the work they had done. "Thank you," Evan said, shaking Edward's hand. "Thank you for believing in me, and in all of us. You've given us more than just a second chance, you've given us a future." Edward smiled, his eyes misting with tears as he embraced Evan. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "It was all of us. We built this together." As the celebration continued, Edward found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had been a long and often difficult road, filled with challenges he hadn't anticipated. But through it all, one thing had remained constant: his belief in the power of people. The decision to give a fortune to a stranger had been a gamble, but it had paid off in ways he could never have imagined. Edward wandered through the garden, taking in the sights and sounds of the celebration. Children played on the grass, families gathered around picnic tables, and the air was filled with laughter and music. It was a scene of pure joy, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As he made his way to the edge of the garden, Edward spotted Daniel standing by one of the flower beds. They hadn't seen each other in person since the press conference years ago, but their bond remained strong. "Daniel," Edward said, approaching him with a smile, "I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel turned, smiling warmly. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the celebration unfold around them. The tension that had once existed between them was long gone, replaced by a deep sense of mutual respect. "You did something incredible here, Edward," Daniel said after a moment. "You didn't just build a center, you built a legacy." Edward shook his head, a modest smile on his face. "We built it together. None of this would have happened without you." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm proud of what we accomplished, and I'm proud of you." Edward looked out at the garden, at the people whose lives had been changed, and felt a deep sense of peace. For years, he had searched for meaning, for a way to use his wealth to make a difference. And now, standing here among the people whose lives had been transformed, he knew that he had found it. This was his legacy, not the money, not the businesses, but the lives he had touched. The community centers would continue long after he was gone, carried on by people like Evan, who had been given a second chance and had used it to help others. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the garden, Edward turned to Daniel with a smile. "We did good," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "We did."